Have you ever envisioned a leader so resolute in defying his adversaries that he would reduce his own territory to cinders, leaving his people famished and erasing all signs of life just to rob his enemies of even the slightest solace? Imagine hamlets consumed by fire, water sources tainted, crops turned to ash, and frightened families driven from their homes. This was not the tactic of a typical warlord. It was the ruthless brilliance of Vlad III, a name that still evokes dread across generations. Welcome to Tales of Mythology, where ancient tales, buried terrors, and otherworldly conflicts are brought to life. If you're captivated by the hidden facets of legend, please give this video a thumbs up, subscribe to our channel, and hit the bell icon below to stay updated with every epic saga. In the spring, Mehmed II, the Sultan renowned for seizing Constantinople, advanced into Wallachia with bold assurance. His aim was clear. System, clear, to crush Vlad's resistance, shatter his spirit, and extend the empire's reach. But what greeted his forces was far from the usual cadence of warfare. The fields lay barren, villages stood as smoldering ruins, and an eerie silence blanketed roads devoid of passers-by. Byzantine historian Leonikos Chalkokondyles recorded that homes were razed, storehouses plundered or demolished, and livestock either butchered or herded away. The invaders hadn't entered a nation, they had wandered into a wasteland crafted by the very man they sought to defeat. The brilliance of this strategy lay in its savagery. Not a single Ottoman soldier could find refuge, sustenance, or even a hint of their foes' whereabouts. Vlad's decision was deliberate. His forces, though fierce, were vastly outnumbered by Mehmed's formidable army. A direct battle would have spelled doom. By sacrificing his own lands, Vlad shifted the scales of survival. Entire communities were uprooted, families forced to abandon their fields to leave nothing for the enemy. Those who stayed behind often met a grim fate. In a letter preserved in the Hungarian National Archives, Vlad wrote with stark pride, "I have slain farmers, men and women, young and old. We have torched everything." This was no confession of regret, it was a declaration of triumph. He was demonstrating to his allies that he could make the Ottoman forces suffer without ever engaging them in open combat. The tactic proved catastrophic for the invaders. Sickness spread through Mehmed's ranks as they drank from poisoned wells. Starvation gnawed at soldiers already worn down by fatigue. Fear crept through the army as they realized their adversary had turned the very land into a weapon against them. These were men who had toppled cities and breached strongholds, yet how do you wage war against hunger? How do you strike at a landscape that refuses to sustain you? Chroniclers noted that morale crumbled, with soldiers deserting, commanders struggling to maintain authority, and even seasoned fighters shaken by the dawning realization that this was not warfare, it was destruction without a battlefield. Yet this was only the prelude to Vlad's campaign of terror. The scorched earth was meant not only to sap Mehmed's troops physically but to erode their resolve. Each ruined village served as a warning of greater horrors to come. Vlad ensured his enemies felt pursued even in the absence of his soldiers, forcing the Ottomans to trudge deeper into despair with every step across charred ground. Venetian diplomatic accounts vividly described the psychological toll, reporting that soldiers fled their posts in terror, their numbers dwindling not from combat but from exhaustion, starvation, and hopelessness. Every burned storehouse was a soldier's tomb. Every tainted well struck another blow to the Sultan's pride. To the world, this campaign seemed pitiless. To Vlad, it was a matter of survival. He knew Wallachia could not fend off a direct assault, but he also understood that fear was a blade sharper than any sword. By turning his homeland into a fiery wasteland, he didn't just create a barrier, he cast a curse upon the invaders. Historians recount villages entirely evacuated or eradicated in the path of the Ottomans. Those left behind were not mere bystanders, they were offerings to Vlad's strategy of dread. This was not just about halting Mehmed's army, it was about ensuring that any invader who dared enter Wallachia would step into a nightmare forged by its ruler. As the Ottomans pressed forward, their strength draining with every fruitless mile, they began to see they were not facing a leader who sought conventional victory. They were up against a ruler who made cruelty his doctrine, survival his terror. Vlad didn't aim merely to triumph, he sought to shatter his enemies' spirits, to etch his name into their fears so deeply that it would haunt their dreams long after the flames died out. Chroniclers agreed this was not the warfare the Ottomans knew. It was obliteration without engagement. The opening chapter of this grim tale reveals not a warrior standing boldly on the battlefield, but a leader willing to reduce his lands to ashes to deny his enemy even a crumb of comfort. As the smoke curled from burning hamlets and the reek of death wafted through Wallachia's breezes, the land itself bore a message. Invaders would find only famine, disease, and despair here. And as Mehmed's troops stumbled deeper into this inferno, they could scarcely imagine the horrors lurking beyond the blackened horizon. As the Ottoman army ventured deeper into Wallachian lands during the summer campaign, they anticipated resistance at strongholds, the clash of blades, and defenders standing firm behind fortified walls. Instead, they were met with a spectacle so ghastly, so deliberately staged, that it silenced even the most courageous warriors. At the gates of Targovist, a key fortress of Wallachia, thousands of bodies rose toward the sky, not soldiers poised for battle, but corpses hoisted upon wooden stakes. The land surrounding the citadel had been transformed into a grotesque forest of death, a nightmarish scene orchestrated with ruthless precision. Ottoman historians, Venetian envoys, and Saxon witnesses all described the horror of that moment. The meticulous arrangement of bodies, the eerie symmetry of the stakes, and the oppressive silence of the fortress, as if the land itself had allied with Vlad to deliver his message. To Mehmed II's battle-hardened troops, this was more than resistance, it was psychological warfare at its most potent. The victims were not only nameless soldiers, many were emissaries, scouts, and captured agents of the Sultan, their fates deliberately displayed to inflict maximum humiliation. Chroniclers from Brasov recount an incident where high-ranking Ottoman envoys, sent to parley, refused to remove their turbans before Vlad as a sign of devotion to their beliefs. Vlad's response was brutal and derisive, then let them be fastened to their skulls in honor of their traditions. Shortly after, their corpses, turbans nailed to their heads with iron spikes, were hoisted onto stakes for all to witness. Whether these precise words were spoken is uncertain, but both Saxon and Slavic records confirm the event, underscoring its symbolic weight. To the Ottomans, it was an act of utter contempt. To Vlad, it was a proclamation that no diplomat, no custom, no sacred ritual would shield his enemies from his fury. Along the roads to Bucharest and Targovist, the same grim spectacle repeated itself. Travelers and soldiers reported pathways lined with impaled bodies, the macabre displays stretching for miles. Some stakes bore fresh victims, others held decayed remains, weathered by the elements yet still serving as grim warnings. Ottoman historian Tursun Bey confessed the impact was profound, noting that even Mehmed's seasoned warriors recoiled at the sight. Fear permeated the ranks, not from the clash of weapons, but from the realization that this enemy defied the conventions of war. Vlad's cruelty was not haphazard, it was a carefully choreographed theater of terror, designed to paralyze his foes before a single blow was struck. Impalement was not Vlad's invention, nor was it unique to Wallachia. It had long existed as a rare form of execution across regions. But under Vlad III, it was perfected, systematized, and transformed into a tool of governance. Historians describe how the stakes were meticulously sharpened and arranged, how victims were hoisted alive, their suffering prolonged for hours or even days. The placement of these impaled bodies was deliberate, their heights varied to form grotesque patterns visible from a distance. To his enemies, these scenes were horrors. To his subjects, they were lessons in obedience. To Vlad, they were proof that fear was mightier than any rampart. One of the most notorious displays occurred as Mehmed II approached Targovist. According to Antonio Bonfini and Leonikos Chalkokondyles, Vlad ordered the impalement of thousands of captives, Ottoman prisoners and Wallachians accused of treason, arranged in a vast spectacle outside the city to confront the Sultan directly. The sight was so staggering that even Mehmed, a leader accustomed to carnage, was reportedly unnerved. Tursun Bey recounts that the Sultan paused his advance upon seeing the field of stakes, shaken not only by the scale of the brutality but by the message it conveyed. He faced a man who ruled through terror, sparing neither foe nor subject. In that moment, the invader realized he was not merely facing a prince. He was facing a master of dread. Yet the terror of impalement was not confined to warfare, it permeated the daily life of Vlad's realm, becoming a cornerstone of his rule. Saxon chronicler Michael Behem describes instances where theft, deceit, or even minor falsehoods were punished with impalement. One account tells of a woman executed for misleading her husband's overseers, an act Vlad deemed a threat to order. Her punishment was the stake. To modern sensibilities, this seems unfathomable cruelty. But in Vlad's era, it was his method of enforcing discipline. Impalement was not merely punishment, it was governance. Every stake erected in a marketplace or along a roadside served as both a warning and a law, blending justice with terror in a way no edict could match. The impact on his people was profound. Obedience was maintained not out of loyalty, but out of fear of suffering the same fate as those displayed in public squares. Even those who hated Vlad were compelled into silence by the knowledge of what awaited dissenters. Foreign visitors recorded how order reigned in Wallachia, not because of prosperity or goodwill, but because of the visible reminders of what happened to those who defied the ruler. These grim monuments were more effective than armies of guards or patrols. The stake itself was both judge and executioner. Thus, impalement became not only Vlad's legacy, but the defining symbol of his reign, a tool of statecraft as sharp and unyielding as the wooden shafts that carried the weight of his enemies. By the time Mehmed's soldiers passed through the fields of death, the message had been etched into their minds with unshakable clarity. They could conquer cities and overthrow kings. But here they faced something more insidious, a man who wielded terror itself as his weapon. Even the Sultan is said to have remarked that one could not easily defeat a man who treated his own subjects and his enemies alike with such merciless severity. Vlad's field of stakes was not just a battlefield. It was a monument, a grotesque declaration carved into flesh and wood that left no doubt about the price of opposition. And as the Sultan's forces marched on, they carried with them not only exhaustion and hunger, but the unshakable memory of thousands of eyes staring lifelessly down from sharpened poles. Mutilation. Among the arsenal of horrors Vlad III employed against his enemies, mutilation occupied a unique and terrifying place. Unlike impalement, which ended a life in a spectacle of suffering, mutilation was a punishment that deliberately left its victims alive. It was a calculated decision to transform men into living messengers of fear to be released back into their own camps and among their comrades as proof of Vlad's resolve. According to Slavic chronicles, prisoners captured during Ottoman campaigns were sometimes deliberately disfigured, their eyes damaged, noses and ears cut away, limbs broken or disabled. These were not acts of sudden rage, nor were they driven by blind cruelty. Instead, they were orchestrated punishments, staged and controlled, meant to strip the enemy of dignity and humanity before sending them limping back to the Sultan. Each scar, each mark carved into flesh, was a warning, an unmistakable sign of the fate that awaited any who dared to march into Wallachia. The psychological impact of this practice cannot be overstated. For the soldiers of Mem II, already struggling with disease and hunger, the sight of comrades returning, broken and mutilated, was enough to spread unease throughout the ranks. These were not tales or rumors. They were men they knew, soldiers who had shared meals and endured battles, now returned in forms that barely resembled their former selves. Contemporary sources describe prisoners branded with hot irons, their bodies etched with humiliating symbols before being cast back into Ottoman lines. In some cases, Slavic texts mention patterns scorched into the skin of captives, interpreted by certain historians as religious mockery, though such details remain debated. Whether or not these specific designs carried symbolic weight, the message was clear. These survivors were not spared through mercy, but through design. Their bodies had become instruments of terror, far more effective than any letter or declaration could ever be. This tactic also struck at the pride of the Sultan himself. Mem II, who had taken Constantinople and shattered the Byzantine Empire, was accustomed to opponents who surrendered, submitted, or fell honorably in battle. Vlad's choice to maim and release captives mocked this code of warfare. It was a calculated insult to the prestige of the Ottoman court, a statement that no custom, no law of war, and no imperial authority could restrain the cruelty of the Wallachian voivode. Each mutilated man who returned to Ottoman ranks served as a living challenge to Mem's authority, a reminder that his empire's might could be defied not through grand armies or great victories, but through terror wielded by one ruler in a corner of the Balkans. Chroniclers noted that this fueled both anger and fear, anger at the humiliation, and fear at the realization that they faced an enemy who did not play by rules familiar to empires. The survivors themselves embodied a paradox of cruelty. They were alive, but their lives were marked forever by the scars inflicted upon them. Many were blind, disfigured, or crippled, no longer able to fight, no longer able to live as they once had. But their suffering did not end at the physical level. Their very presence in the Ottoman camps reminded others that survival was not salvation. The battlefield offered no guarantee of honor in death or dignity in life. Vlad's captives became voices of despair, their mutilated forms whispering louder than screams. This was terror turned into spectacle, not through death, but through survival. In their broken bodies, they carried a message of cruelty designed to seep into the minds of every soldier who dared to cross the Danube again. Reports compiled in the Skazany o Dracula Voivode described these mutilations with brutal clarity. Prisoners had noses or ears cut away, others had their eyes blinded, and some were permanently marked with heated irons. These punishments were not scattered random acts of vengeance, but consistent elements of Vlad's wider campaign of psychological war. The Ottomans, confronted by these survivors, could not dismiss them as exaggerations or propaganda. They were undeniable proof, flesh and blood, evidence of the extremes to which Vlad was willing to go. In this way, mutilation extended his reach far beyond the immediate battlefield. Each broken captive became a silent ambassador of terror, carrying his message into the very heart of the enemy's army. The long-term consequences of this practice echoed beyond the immediate campaign. Soldiers grew hesitant, morale crumbled further, and the specter of mutilation added a layer of dread to every skirmish and patrol. To be captured did not mean ransom, nor imprisonment, nor even a swift execution. It meant a deliberate degradation, a future in which survival itself was worse than death. Even hardened officers found themselves unsettled by this reality. For in Vlad's theater of cruelty, there was no boundary between soldier and symbol. Every captive risked becoming a tool in his arsenal, a weapon of fear carried on mutilated flesh. The discipline of Mem's army could withstand hunger, disease, even loss on the battlefield. But how could it withstand the return of its own men in forms designed to strip them of humanity? For Vlad, this strategy was entirely consistent with his vision of rule and resistance. He did not seek merely to repel invaders. He sought to engrave his authority into the minds of friend and foe alike. The scorched villages broke the body of the army. The stakes shattered their spirit. And the mutilated survivors whispered fear long after the fires were extinguished. Each act of mutilation reinforced his claim as a ruler who was not bound by limits of mercy or diplomacy. He redefined the battlefield, shifting the struggle from open combat into a realm of psychological annihilation. To his people, these acts were a reminder that their ruler commanded not only their lives, but also their enemies' fears. To his foes, they were an unanswerable challenge, a constant reminder that cruelty itself had become a weapon. As chronicles from both Slavic and Ottoman sources confirm, the impact of this tactic rippled across the campaign. Mem's soldiers grew uneasy at night, whispering about the fates of those who disappeared into the forests, only to return mutilated beyond recognition. Some deserted, others faltered in their duty, and many began to question whether their sultan's conquest could overcome such a nightmare. These men carried wounds beyond the physical, wounds that spread despair like infection. Vlad had turned living men into his most powerful propaganda, his most relentless envoys. They returned not as warriors, but as proof of a strategy that placed terror at the heart of resistance. Terror. As the campaign dragged on, the image of Vlad III as a ruler who thrived on terror became undeniable. His methods were not the chaotic acts of a desperate warlord, but carefully orchestrated strategies that blended cruelty with political calculation. By scorched earth, by forests of impaled bodies, and by mutilated survivors turned into living messages, he had forced Mem II's great army into a psychological trap. What made his tactics extraordinary was not their novelty. Other rulers had burned villages or executed captives, but the scale, consistency, and precision with which Vlad transformed them into instruments of policy set him apart. He wielded terror like a sculptor wields his chisel, carving fear into the minds of enemies and allies alike. For Wallachia, surrounded by empires and threatened on all sides, survival depended not on strength of numbers, but on the ability to convince larger powers that every step into his land would be poisoned with dread. The chilling brilliance of his cruelty becomes even clearer when we consider how it shaped the campaign itself. Ottoman soldiers did not face an enemy they could defeat with a decisive battle. Instead, they wandered through lands that resisted them at every turn, fields devoid of food, villages where corpses rotted on stakes, roads where mutilated comrades stumbled back to camp. Chroniclers from Venice, Saxony, and Constantinople all noted that morale within the Ottoman ranks faltered more from despair than from combat. Hunger could weaken men, but terror unmade them. Even when no Wallachian soldiers appeared in sight, the army felt as if they were surrounded by enemies, phantoms created by fear. Every stake was a warning. Every mutilated survivor a prophecy. Every burned village a whisper that they were fighting not against men, but against death itself personified in their opponent. For Vlad, terror was never limited to his enemies. Within Wallachia, the same methods kept order among his subjects. Chroniclers describe a land where crime was rare, not because of prosperity or benevolence, but because every infraction risked punishment as horrifying as the torments inflicted on foreign soldiers. Theft, dishonesty, or even laziness could end in death on the stake or in humiliating punishment. To many of his contemporaries, this brutality brought a form of stability, for no one dared to challenge a ruler whose justice was indistinguishable from horror. To others, it marked him as a tyrant whose reign was remembered more for the fear he inspired than for the safety he provided. But in either case, terror was the foundation of his power. The very cruelty that repulsed observers also secured his throne. The Ottoman chronicler Tursun Bey observed that even Sultan Mehmed, who had conquered Constantinople and faced countless foes, was visibly unsettled when confronted with Vlad's works. According to accounts, the Sultan paused in his advance when his army encountered the infamous field of the impaled outside Targovist. There, thousands of stakes carried the broken bodies of captives, Ottoman prisoners, and Wallachian traitors alike, arranged in precise formations like a grotesque army standing in eternal defiance. "What can be done against a man," the Sultan is said to have remarked, "who does this to his own people?" In that moment, Vlad had succeeded not only in terrifying the soldiers, but in striking at the heart of imperial pride itself. If even the conqueror of empires could falter, what hope did ordinary soldiers have of resisting the terror of Wallachia's voivode? The strategy extended beyond immediate campaigns. By turning cruelty into policy, Vlad shaped how he would be remembered by contemporaries and by history. Reports of his deeds spread quickly through Europe, carried by merchants, ambassadors, and fugitives. In Saxon towns and Venetian courts, tales of the Impaler prince circulated like dark legends, part horror and part fascination. Some saw in him a defender of Christendom against the Ottomans, willing to do whatever it took to resist invasion. Others denounced him as a monster, no different from the barbarity he claimed to oppose. Yet whether praised or condemned, his reputation grew. In many ways, this was his ultimate triumph. He ensured that fear of his name outlived the flames of war. Terror was not only a tactic of the moment. It was a legacy carefully cultivated, a shadow that stretched far beyond his lifetime. Even those who suffered under his rule could not deny the effectiveness of his strategies. Wallachia, a small principality pressed between great powers, could never hope to dominate by strength alone. Yet under Vlad, it became a land dreaded by empires. His enemies learned that to march into his territory meant to be stripped of food, haunted by corpses, and mocked by the mutilated faces of their own comrades. His allies, meanwhile, saw in him a ruler whose cruelty served as a shield against foreign domination. Whether they approved of his methods or not, they could not ignore that he had forced the mighty Ottoman Empire to hesitate, to falter, to reconsider. In a world defined by conquest and power, hesitation was a victory. Terror, in this way, was not a byproduct of his reign. It was the very essence of his strategy. The enduring question is whether Vlad's cruelty was driven by necessity or by personal savagery. Was the scorched earth merely strategy? The stakes a weapon of war? The mutilations acts of psychological calculation? Or was he simply a man who took pleasure in suffering? Contemporary sources leave us with contradictions. His own letters boast of the devastation he inflicted, unapologetic and almost proud of the blood he spilled. Chroniclers from rival nations depict him as a fiend whose cruelty surpassed comprehension. Yet all agree on one point: no other ruler of his time turned cruelty into such a consistent, deliberate system of governance and war. For Vlad, terror was not merely an act of violence. It was a philosophy of rule, a method to ensure his enemies feared him more than they desired to conquer his land. By the end of his campaigns, the Ottomans had not been decisively defeated. Yet, they had been scarred in ways that weapons alone could not achieve. The soldiers who returned carried with them not just memories of hardship, but visions of fire, stakes, and broken men. The land they had tried to conquer lingered in their minds as a place of nightmares, where even survival was worse than death. Vlad had succeeded in something few rulers could claim. He made fear itself into his greatest ally, a shield stronger than walls, sharper than swords, and longer-lasting than any victory on the battlefield. His reign was proof of how terror, when refined and calculated, could become the most devastating weapon of all.